Hello, everyone. My name is Tyler Hacking, and today I'll be speaking to you about secondary metabolites and phenolics. Secondary metabolites go by many names: specialized metabolites, toxins, secondary products, natural products. And they're defined by not being directly related to the normal growth and development or reproduction of that organism. And they are categorized into subcategories and subcategories that are below those. The ones that we'll be discussing today are terpenes, phenolics, and the N and S containing compounds, which is nitrogen and sulfur. Many people would know those compounds as alkaloids for the most part. The other interesting thing about secondary metabolites is that they're often specifically only found within a small phylogenetic group, and that has a lot to do with their biosynthetic pathways being specific to the isometric structure of the organism's DNA. The purpose of these molecules is very interesting. As mentioned, it has nothing to do with the development and reproduction and growth of the organism. And so they have a secondary role. And much of the roles that secondary metabolites play have to do with their ecological interactions. A majority of them are protection against things that eat them, because plants are full of carbohydrates and sugars and all sorts of delicious things. And everybody wants to eat plants, especially insects. So plants biosynthesize secondary metabolites as a way to protect themselves from not only insects, but also to make themselves taste bitter and astringent or spicy, for example, as protection against mammals and animals and all sorts of things that like to eat plants. The other interesting thing is that on the opposite spectrum, you see that some secondary metabolites are specifically made to attract insects, like pollinators or animals that disperse seeds. Right, we spoke about most of that already. I like this diagram because it exemplifies how secondary metabolites are used in different ways. They are biosynthesized similarly to proteins and nucleic acids and lipids, but they go through a different pathway. Essentially, they're carbohydrates and simple sugars that are used in combination with other chemicals in order to create secondary metabolites. Here are some of the photosynthetic biosynthetic pathways for the production of different compounds in plants. There are many different kinds of secondary metabolites. I am only going to briefly speak about terpenes today because Andrew is covering that section. Terpenes are what we would familiarize ourselves or be familiar with as smells and scents. And a lot of people mix up flavonoids for that mechanism, but it's actually terpenes that you're smelling. And we're finding in organic chemistry that they have a lot of interactive functions, and sometimes they act as a mechanism to transport a molecule from one place to another or have other chemical interactive effects. Secondary metabolites are used to make a number of different plant structures, including cutin, waxes, and suberin. These can act as protective layers for the plant, making it more difficult for insects and other organisms to eat them, but it also helps to retain water. Different waxes serve different purposes, and they're layered in different ways based on that purpose. And so, for example, you often find denser waxes at the top, at the outside of the layer of skin, and less dense waxes beneath that. Many of these waxes act as a part of how plants transpire. They help with the structure and enable for the movement of the different gases and liquids involved in transpiration. All right, now we are finally to phenols. Phenols are also referred to as phenolics. They're a type of resin, and they form specifically through reactions of carbolic acid and are catalyzed by an acid or base. When the carbolic acid combines with formaldehyde or urea or resorcinol, I probably said that wrong, or melamine, you get all sorts of different kinds of phenolic products. Humans use phenols for all sorts of different purposes. We use it as a sanitizer, for example, and for all sorts of different experiments in laboratory settings. One recognizable use is with hard plastics, which we would call polycarbonate. So all of the CDs and DVDs and Blu-rays and things like special protective glasses or even bulletproof glass are a type of phenolic compound, polyphenols. And poly just means many, right? And so there are many phenols together. This chemical structure in the center is a phenol, and a polyphenol is more than one. Everybody loves epoxy resins, but we also see phenolic epoxies in other forms, in the forms of adhesives and insulators. Bakelite has the ability to resist damage, and so people use it as a protective varnish on wood and use it in other construction scenarios. It's very heat resistant, which is very nice, and it acts as a binding agent. Everyone is familiar with nylon. We all have some kind of clothing with nylon, and it has very interesting properties because it's structurally connective in a way that allows elongation, and so it's really easy to stretch, but it's also tough and resists damage. The structure of nylon also resists microbial consumption. So when microbes secrete enzymes to try to break down and consume nylon, they have a very hard time, specifically because the structure is resistant to enzymatic activity. Humans use nylon to form clothing from fibers. There is also phenolic soap, and it has very interesting properties. It's a surfactant, and so it causes solutions to spread out. It's very interesting, and it disperses things in that solution. And so it can be used to make things like emulsifications. I've used this technique before to create organic pesticides that I spray onto plants, and it allows you to force together water and oil, which is very interesting. Phenols come in many different forms. They can be extracted, concentrated, and separated and processed and changed chemically into things like herbicides. Some herbicides are selective and kill only certain organisms, while other herbicides kill all plants. Humans use phenolic compounds in a variety of forms. There are many different medicines that are phenolic in composition. We'll come back to this topic in just a moment. These images are of crops that were taken this year in Utah, hemp crops. And even though these crops are so low on the psychoactive ingredient THC that they are not psychoactive, they still provide medical purpose, a lot of different medical purposes. I know people at UVU who use hemp oil, for example, to treat a variety of different medical conditions. And people don't just grow it for the psychoactive use, they grow it for neuroregulatory use. Everybody has heard about glyphosate in the last couple of years in the news. And the way that glyphosate works is it blocks the shikimic acid pathway that plants, fungi, and bacteria have, it not in animals. And so I don't fully understand how it causes cancer, but it is bad for humans. A lot of people have stopped using glyphosate. It increases your risk of cancer by 40%. The structure of secondary metabolitic phenolic compounds can determine whether they attract insects or kill insects. And the concentrations present inside of plant tissue of the amounts of these different phenolic compounds will determine a lot about how much that plant is consumed, how much herbivory it experiences. Because bugs like to eat good tasting things also. The other interesting thing about these compounds and herbivory is that in response to plants increasing the concentrations of these phenolic compounds, found inside of them, the insects and herbivores that eat them become more resistant through natural selection as the herbivores who consume an amount that is toxic for them, they die. And so if they don't have, the mutations that allow them to break down or resist that toxin, then all of the non-resistant organisms would die off, which increases the resistance of the gene pool that's left and causes both the plant and its herbivore to evolve back and forth between the concentrations of these phenolic compounds inside of the plant and the resistance of the herbivore. All right, now what everybody's been waiting for, back to cannabis. Hemp is a type of cannabis. All extant cannabis is the same species, and all of the subspecies are subsumed under Cannabis sativa linnaeus. Cannabis is a very good example because it contains over 100 identified phenolic compounds, which we call cannabinoids, or more specifically, phytocannabinoids having come from plants. Cannabinoids are an interesting category of molecule because your body also makes cannabinoids. We call them endocannabinoids. The reason that these phenolic compounds can interact with us is because they share a very similar molecular structure to that of endogenous cannabinoids, the endocannabinoids. And all cannabinoids have a structure that can attach to your receptors, with some exceptions. And for example, when you decarboxylate some of those organic compounds by taking off the acetyl group, it can then become what we would call bioavailable by being, at that point, a structure that could interact with your receptor site. Here are some of the identified compounds that have been found in cannabis. This is a wonderful book. If you would like to check it out, I highly recommend it. As you can see, all of the chemical structures have a similar phenolic base, and most are polyphenolic, having more than one phenol. Most natural medicines that we extract from plants and fungi are in the phenolic category. Some fall under the other secondary metabolite categories, such as alkaloids, for example. One that many people are familiar with is mescaline or peyote. The images to the right display different varieties of Lophophora, and I wanted to share something very interesting about Lophophora. Most of its endemic habitat is in Texas and New Mexico and parts of North Mexico. Human development has devastated their habitat and put them into an endangered category, each of the different species of the genus Lophophora. It's known for its psychoactive, medical, and spiritual use here in the United States by indigenous Native American people. But what I found really interesting is that in Thailand, through grafting techniques, the populations of Lophophora are slowly increasing. And this is specifically because of cacti collectors, people who are willing to spend a tremendous amount of money to own collections of beautiful cacti, because in Thailand they have a very close connection with nature. And when asked about the psychoactive use or the idea of consuming it for that purpose, they think that that's something that they wouldn't normally do, at least most people there. And for them, they just like to preserve and respect nature. And so different cultures have very different ethnobotanical uses, or in the instances of Thailand, an ornamental use, just out of love for plants. Lignans are important as well. And we find most lignans in grains, vegetables, and berries. You can have antimicrobial properties as well. Flavonoids are a very diverse group of compounds, and they are generally associated with pigmentation, which is why the plant kingdom has such a huge diversity of colors, so much more than we can actually see. And so when we illuminate plants under UVB radiation, for example, um, sometimes you can actually see differences that you normally wouldn't be able to see, because plants are much more photosensitive than us, and they can perceive a much greater range of light, of the light spectrum, than we can. And the interesting thing is that this is also used to attract the attention of certain insects, which are capable of seeing into some of those spectrums. The picture on the right is um, phytodermatitis. It's a reaction to touching a plant. So some plants are, they create defense molecules on the outside of themselves because they don't want to be eaten. I mean, most plants don't want to be eaten, and so a lot of plants have trichomes with different toxins, phytotoxins, that cause swelling and blistering, and in some cases, tremendous pain. Tannins are interesting, and they're used, for example, for tanning leather, and they help to bind together collagen proteins, which helps to make them more heat resistant, water resistant, and microbe resistant. This is an amazing, beautiful picture of tannins that have been released from plants into the river. All right, now to food. Phenolics are the flavor of your entire world, and they're all over the place. They are all of the wonderful things that you like to eat. Many extracts are ethyl extracts of phenolic compounds of a variety of different types, and also mixtures with terpenes. The structure of different phenolic compounds determines the refraction of the wavelength of light off of it and the nanometer width of that wavelength, which determines the color that you see. This is not just for ecological interaction, but it actually acts as protectant for the plant, which makes its own sunscreen inside of its own cells, kind of like animals make melanin and fungi as well. Plants will make different phenolic compounds that protect their cells from photonic degradation, from damage from radiation, by controlling the intensity and amount of photons that can interact with their cells. And so some flavonoids, for example, are made specifically to protect the plant from too much light. Okay. So in conclusion, phenolic compounds enable biological functions such as defense from herbivory and the environment. They and let me reiterate, I'm sorry, secondary metabolites. They are the source of nearly all foods, medicines, cosmetics, textiles, and more. They are not directly involved in normal growth, development, or reproduction of the organism, and they're often restricted to a narrow set of species within a phylogenetic group. All right, and the last part, I was able to conduct a side-by-side experiment on one of my clients' farms in Blanding, Utah last year. The experiment was how impactful would adding some organic material to the soil and keeping it alive with compost and compost tea, specifically vermicompost, which is made from worms. And so I taught my client how to make worm bins and how to maintain the worm population, how to extract the vermicompost, and then how to use it to make compost tea and incorporate it into their fields. And the picture on the top exemplifies the field that was not treated. And as you can see, the plants are very underdeveloped. This is mostly due to nutrient toxicity because the soil in this area is completely sand, clay, salt, and heavy metal contaminants, and even some radioactive material in some areas. The picture on the bottom was treated, and what happened is it enabled the plant to access micronutrients from the soil and things that were fixated in the clay, for example. Also, the presence of the microbes helps to somewhat balance out the solution of the soil because they will start to break down things that are in excess sometimes. So this is a fantastic example of the difference between using compost or not, and where it ties into secondary metabolites and phenolics is, well, not only is the biomass different between the two fields, but the amount of secondary metabolites that the plant was able to make was exponentially greater, specifically because of that. And so when the plant is developing, it will make, primary metabolites, but it will also make secondary metabolites, and they do work rather interestingly together. Um, the crops on the top were also infested with pathogens, very likely a whole bunch of different mites and things like that. Very likely because they couldn't make very many secondary metabolites. And they also had a lot of sunburning, once again, probably because of a lack of secondary metabolitic production. Whereas the plants on the bottom were much healthier, did not have insects, probably because they smelled very potent to those insects, very strong in their secondary metabolitic composition. All right, thanks for joining me, everybody. Have a great day. And here are your questions.